out. Okay, so what I'm going to go is go over here, go the other way. Or is it this way? There we go. Do I have a Zoom? Where am I? I guess that's as big as I'm going to be able to make it. All right. Hi, my name's Garth. I'm one of the co-leads at OWASP Ottawa. What's going to happen is I'll just make a few public service announcements about the chapter and things like that. I'll introduce our speaker, and then our speaker will have the floor. But before I get started, how many here have not been here before for one of our meetups or one of our events? Well, welcome. So we're, how do I say this? We're a welcoming group. We don't bite. We welcome all levels. We're going to be having more events, like we had a CTF last month. We're going to do other events coming up. We have a couple of ideas. One is a CTF 101 for people who've not done CTFs before. We're looking at other kinds of events outside of our regular meetups where we have speakers speak about subjects on security, not just web application security, because the W now has changed for OWASP. That's an old banner. It now means worldwide, because guess what? We're not just talking about web applications. We have a chapter page at OWASP that will send you there. We've given out some cards which have all our socials, as well as another QR code that will send you to that same page, which also has our updates and any of our socials as well. Yes, we are still on Twitter. I refuse to call it X. We're on Mastodon. We're on Blue Sky. We're on LinkedIn. It's kind of overwhelming. What else? I'd like to talk about the benefits of membership in OWASP. And the reason for that is because it helps us. If you become a member, if you can identify this chapter, and then we get to get some of that money from OWASP to do events and make t-shirts and things like that. So there's also cheaper access to other events, meaning other OWASP type sponsored events. This slide deck has a whole list of them, including training. You get another Google account, that sort of thing. What else? I talked about the socials. That's our Blue Sky. I can't really see it from here, so I'm just going to try to go through them. So we have a Slack associated with the chapter. There's a number of different channels in that Slack, including jobs. So if you've got a job, post it there. If you're looking for a job, go see those postings. And there is the register for the main OWASP Slack. Look at the card, it'll have the registration for the other Slack. This chapter wouldn't function without the support of volunteers. And so this is a shout out to all those people who volunteered to help, including I'd like to thank Greg and Rewind for bringing us pizza. Pizza is always nice. I'd like to thank Mia and Melody for their help, and particularly in the CTF that we did last month. And Sunny and Asmo can't be here, and I thought I saw Harsh before. Oh, there he is. And Logan, who's decided that he's sick, and we thank him for staying home this time. and Rick, who's put together these slides for us, as well as Adam and Chris, also known as Patient Zero. OWASP has a Parthenon of projects, and so they're Wrong Secrets, Defect Dojo, and one I don't think I've even heard of before called Secure Codebox, who have had recent releases. We're looking at having a meetup quarterly in Canada for those of you who have to try to drive down here from the West End.
Yeah.
Let's just take a moment and pause for them as they have to deal with traffic. Okay. So we're thinking about doing that quarterly. And I think that's it. So I'd like to introduce our speaker so I can not awkwardly go through these slides. Maybe what I'll get you to do is to talk a bit about yourself.
Sure.
Because I think you can probably introduce yourself better than me fumbling.
I hope so.
Flip over to your screen. There we go.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Thank you all for joining here. My name is Rifat Sheikh Youssef. I am a director with EY in the cyber identity and cybersecurity practice. We work with different. This is about like consulting. So we work with large customers and small customers to transfer or transform their SIAM and workforce solutions, IAM solutions into using more modern solutions like solutions based on OAuth and OpenID Connect, right? So that's on my work side. I'm also chair of the OAuth work group at the IETF. Who heard of the IETF? Okay, few. So maybe I'll take then a moment to talk about the IETF, and maybe future talks will kind of dig deeper a little bit and talk about the IETF. So the IETF is the standard body that defines all the protocols for the internet. Everything that you see on the internet are protocols defined by the IETF. It starts from the routing layer all the way to the application layer, TCP/IP stack, the whole stack, HTTP, TLS, OAuth, DNS, everything that you know about the internet. These are protocols defined by the IETF. It's an international organization, standard body that spans like many organizations participate from major corporations like Microsoft, Google, Apple to smaller ones, right? So, and it's one that it defines the whole protocol, the protocols for the internet, right? And OAuth is one of those. And I chair the OAuth work group, which is at the heart of the identity these days. So any IAM solution these days, from Microsoft to Okta to Auth0 to Google's to Apple's implementation, all of those use OAuth at the heart of their solution. Right? So I'm gonna talk about, give you an introduction. It's a little bit technical. It's not just a high level. So we'll deep dive into the protocols and see how things happen under the hood too. Okay. Let's get going. So OAuth is an open standard that defines a delegation framework. So what does that mean? It's a framework that allows an end user to grant an application access to specific resources without sharing their credentials with the application. This is kind of mouthful, so let me give you examples, right? So if you're familiar with that Mint application, it's an application that allows you to connect to, if you have multiple accounts, for example, you have multiple bank accounts and and mortgage accounts and investment accounts for with different organizations. It allows you to consolidate all of those into one view, and kind of monitor what's going on there, right? So the idea of OAuth is to enable applications like this, like Mint, to connect to your bank accounts without sharing your bank account credentials with the Mint application, right? That's the critical part. You don't want to share your credentials with the application, otherwise they can do whatever they want. So you want to allow them access to your bank account, and limited access, for example, just read-only access, right? So that's the whole idea of OAuth, right? So a different example, you can grant an application access to your Twitter account, and it will send a tweet on your behalf. Again, you don't share your Twitter credentials with the application. That doesn't happen. Another idea is, or another way of using this is, you grant an application access to your Dropbox or Google Drive, right? Same idea. Credentials, the Google Drive credentials, are not shared with the application, okay? By the way, like, you can stop me and ask questions anytime. You don't have to wait till the end, okay? So that's the OAuth. Now, the OpenID Connect is a different organization that is focused on authentication part, right? And it defined an identity layer on top of OAuth protocol. So it allows an application to verify the identity of the end user and allow him to log in to an application, okay? For example, and I give you a few examples here. For example, a user, if you go and log into your ChatGPT today, you actually get redirected to Auth 0, you get authenticated and come back to log in again. And we'll show you those examples in a second. You can, again, if you log into ChatGPT, you can also log in with Google account through Auth 0. And we'll show you examples of this. So at the end of this presentation, I'll do a few demos, so you'd see this in real life, and you see the exchange of what's happening there. So I'll show you a user login to an application using Auth 0. I'll show you a user login to an application using AWS Cognito. I'll show you a user login to an application through Auth 0 with federation to Google. And then I'll show you an application making an API call on behalf of the user, okay? Okay, so before we get going, I want to define two important terms to make sure we are clear on those, because many people get confused with those terms. The first one is authentication. Authentication is the process of verifying the identity of an end user. It could be an end user, it could be a device, it could be a workload, but it's identifying that entity, okay? So that's what authentication is all about. Authorization is the process of controlling access to that user, right? So let me give you an example. When you go to the airport, you go with your passport. You get the airport, you give them their passport. They authenticate you. They know who you are right now based on your passport. Just because you have a passport doesn't mean that you can board a plane, right? So you need a boarding pass. So the boarding pass is your authorization. The passport itself is your authentication. With the passport, you authenticate yourself. They know who you are. And with the boarding pass, you are allowed to board this plane or get access to that resource, in this case, just boarding the plane. Is that clear? Any questions? Okay. Okay, so let's start talking about the OAuth framework. There are a number of elements or components that participate in this kind of framework, right? The first one is the resource owner. It's RO here. It's the end user, and the end user uses user agents. It could be the browser, it could be a mobile app. These are the ways that the user uses his applications to communicate with those applications, right? At the top, we have the AS, stands for Authorization Server. It is the entity that authenticates the users and issues token to that entity. At the right, we have RS, stands for Resource Server, and this is the APIs that you want to give the user the application access to. And at the bottom, you have the client, which is the application that you are trying to either log in or give it access to whatever APIs you want to give it access. Again, for example, you want to give it access to your bank account, right? The reason I'm using those terms is that these are the terms that used in the standard. Like if you go and read the RFCs that the IETF produced, you'll see those terms. But if you see RS or resource server, you can also replace it with API. It's the same thing. And sometimes in the documents, you'll see resource server or an API. And when you see a client, it's the application, okay? And this slide is going to show you just a little bit more details. I just wrote it down. Like you have the resource owner, the user agent, authorization server, resource server, and client or application, okay? Okay, now we have that framework, right? We have those components. To be able to get this to work together and securely, you need first to do a number of setups to make sure those components know each other and authenticate each other, right? So first, you need to define a specific domain or sometimes even create a tenant on the authorization server. Second, you need to define the APIs that you want to protect. The third, you want to register the client or the applications that you want to enable and allow access to your resources. And the fourth is you need to create a user store to allow the user to authenticate against that database or a user store, okay? So I'm going to walk you through example of how to do all of this. And then after that, we'll talk about the flow itself and what happens, okay? And again, feel free to stop me anytime, ask questions. Don't wait until the end, okay? Okay, so the first step is to create a domain or a tenant. If the AS is a multi-tenant, you need to create a tenant, and then you create a domain, right? So in this example, and I'm showing here an example of, there are obviously lots of providers out there, like Auth0, Okta, Microsoft Entra ID, AWS Cognito, and more, right? In this case, I'm showing Auth0 example, but you can, like other platforms, use the same thing. The UI will be different, but it's the same concept, right? In this case, we're talking about creating a tenant. You can select like in this case, you select your domain and select the region. In this case, I'm selecting the US, and you associate a tag with this, okay? So now you have a tenant with a specific domain assigned to you as like whatever applications you wanna deploy will be in context of this tenant. Okay. Okay. Now you wanna define the APIs. So these are the APIs that this tenant will be protecting. So if you wanna be able to access that API, you need to authenticate against that tenant, and that tenant will give you access to this API with the token, and we'll see how that works later on. In this case, I have a to-do API on Azure. I just call it like this because I've created an API. I deployed it on Azure, and I actually deployed it on another cloud platform called Render. The reason I'm using those is just free accounts. You can create free accounts and deploy whatever if you wanna just play with those. So and I'm gonna use and show you APIs live. Like we have an API on the internet, and we will try to access that API at the end. Okay. Okay. So we added an API. Now we know what we are trying to protect. Now we need to create the client or the application. We need to register that application with the AS, right? And there are a number of different types of applications. In this presentation, I will focus on one type of applications. It's called a regular web app. The regular web app is an application that runs on a server, and you communicate with that application through a browser. Okay, but the application itself runs mainly on a server. There are other types. Native app, for example, it's an application that runs on your mobile device or a native laptop. And single page app is an application, a browser-based application, but the whole application runs in the browser itself. There is no server to communicate with. You just use authenticate yourself and then make API calls directly. Okay. And the last part is the machine-to-machine communication. In that case, typically, a typical use case is CLI, command lines, and or business-to-business use cases. So you use this type of machine-to-machine flow. Okay, so that's a client. For now, we're going to use the regular web app. Okay, so now we created the application. Application is ready for this. Now we create a user store. In this case, I'm using a user store on the Auth0 platform. Okay, so I've created the user and I assigned it a password, and I'm just created there and then when I try to log in, I have the credentials ready. So this is a user store on the platform itself. Typically, platforms also allow you to connect to external database. For example, if you have something in your corporation and you don't want to export it to that platform, you can do a connection back to your corporation and get the database information from there, right? Or authenticate the user against your database. Okay? And the last part is social connection. You could also enable the user to log in through their Google account. And this is where you can configure this on that platform. Okay? Okay, and any questions so far? Is that clear so far? Like we're just trying to set up the whole thing and make sure that each component know about each other and ready for later kind of operation. Okay, any questions?
Just to recap something,
Yep.
using OAuth in conjunction with Connect.
So we will see those flows, yes, later on. But for now, these are just configurations, right? Okay. But yes, we will use OAuth and OpenID Connect, okay? And we will talk about the endpoints and the tokens in a second, okay? Any other questions? Okay. Okay, now OAuth defines a long list of endpoints, but we're going to talk this time about two endpoints. These are the most important endpoints. The authorization endpoint or a front end endpoint, and the token endpoint, which is the back end endpoint. The front end endpoint or authorization endpoint is the endpoint that allows the user to communicate with the AS, authenticate themselves, and they get a code, a temporary code that they will exchange with or send to the client, and the client then will use that to use the backend endpoint or token endpoint to get the tokens, and we will see those in details in a second. Okay. Now, again, there are many other endpoints, and hopefully we can talk about those in future presentations. But for now, we'll talk about those specific two endpoints. These are the most important ones. OpenID defines a different endpoint. We're not going to use it this time, but this is the user info endpoint. It's an endpoint that allows you to obtain more information about the user or allows the client to obtain more information about the user using the access token that will be minted initially. So we'll talk about and show you how to obtain the tokens. But in this presentation, I'm not going to be talking about this user info endpoint at this point. Okay. Now, the OAuth client itself also has a redirection endpoint. So when the client sends the user or sends the browser to the AS, it will tell the AS, hey, after you're done authenticating the user, please redirect him back to this endpoint, right? So that's what the redirection endpoint is all about. Okay. Okay. Any questions so far about the endpoint? Clear? Endpoint, by the way, is just an HTTP API, right? That's what we mean by endpoint, okay? Okay. OAuth defines two types of tokens. Access token, which is a token that the client will use to access an API or a resource, okay? And a refresh token, which is a token that the client will use to communicate with the AS to obtain new access token. And I'm showing here where you can use, you can see that the refresh token is used between the client and the AS, and the access token is used between the client and the API. Okay, that's the role of each one of those. We're not going to talk about the refresh token in this presentation, but we will talk about the access token in this presentation. Okay, we'll talk about the free refresh token maybe in the future. The OpenID Connect defines an ID token. ID token is the token that will be issued to allow the user to log in to the application. So this is issued to the client, and the ID token will stay with the client. It will never be used to call the API. Same thing with the refresh token. It will never be used with the API. It just stays with the client, okay? The only token that you could use with the API should be the access token, okay? Okay, any questions so far? Good? Okay, so tokens come in different structures or different data structures. There is a reference data structure, which is just a random value that understood only by the AS. Or it's a structured token, which is a self-contained token that has enough information for the API to consume it, okay? And we'll show examples of those. When we're going to talk about the structured one, we're not going to talk about the reference token in this presentation. Again, maybe we can talk about those in future presentations. And there are two types of tokens. There is a bearer token, meaning anyone that holds that token can use it. Think about if you have, if I have a $100 bill, I can go to any store and use that $100 bill, right? If I drop that bill and somebody picks it up, they can use it too. There is no association between that bill and myself. It's just whoever holds that token, that bill, can use it. The sender constraint token is different. It is the token that is specific to a specific client or associated with a client. Whoever wants to use that token, they need to prove that they actually own that token. And the way it's done is typically you have a key pair, and you hold a private key, and you register the public key. And I'm not going to talk about this in this presentation. Yeah, go ahead.
So in implementations that you've seen, how common is this sender constraint token?
Okay, good question. This is actually an RFC that was published by the OAuth group at the IETF late last year. So you wouldn't see too much implementation at this stage, but it's getting there. People are kind of started looking into it, right? For now, the majority of implementation is a bearer token. And that's the reason I don't want to talk about the sender constraint token at this point, but hopefully in future presentation, we can talk about those a bit more in details, okay? So it's bearer token for now, okay? Okay, now, many of those tokens, we talked about the structure. Typically, the structure is a JSON web token, or JWT, what we call JWT. It's just a way to represent information. And I'll show you an example in a second, and we will show examples, real examples, after we run the demo there, right? So it has a number of claims in that token. And these are typically in a name value pair. Okay, let me show you an example. So this is the JOT structure. It has a header, a payload, and a signature. So a header just talks about the algorithm and the type. The payload is where the meat of the information is, like all the details. And the signature is the signature around the whole structure to make sure nobody is able to tamper with this. Okay. Okay. Now we're almost there for the like to dig into the details. So now I'm gonna register. Remember, we've talked about different types of applications. I'm gonna talk about the regular web app only in this presentation. We can talk about others in the future. So in this case, again, I have a to-do regular web application. I have my my account, my tenant at Auth0 at demo-rifat.us.auth0.com. This is my account. And I have this application that is assigned a client ID and a client secret. This is typically assigned by the platform itself. Okay. So when I go and create the application, the platform will assign those to me, and I will have to configure my application to use those credentials. Okay. Okay. Now we want to start kind of talking about the flow. Now everything is set up, everything is ready. So what happened when the user clicks the login button? Okay. So at this point, I want to show you an overview of the full flow, and then later we'll dig deeper into some of those in details. Okay. So the user clicks the login, an HTTP request is sent to the application, for example, a login. And the application is interested in redirecting the user back to Auth0, for example. So it will send 302 to the AS. Okay. The browser then goes to the AS and send that GET request to the authorization endpoint, the front end endpoint, right? Now, and then we get that login page, right? I'm not going to present that login page and all that information because this is a proprietary stuff that happens between the browser and the AS and has nothing to do with the protocol. The protocol doesn't tell you how to do that, right? So now that at this point, the user is in front of the login page, they will provide their credentials only to the AS. The application never sees those credentials. So they will provide that information to the AS. They will get authenticated. If everything is fine, it will get redirected back to the application with a code, okay? Now the browser sends that code to the application. The application then will go back and exchange that code with the AS to get the tokens, okay? At this point, the application has access to the ID token and the access token. Because it has access to the ID token, the user is logged in, and now it has access token, it can make a call to the API. If the user wants to do that, then you get a request, you send that request to the API and get whatever information is needed, okay? So that's at a high level. I'm gonna double click on some of those, and at the end also show you in real life example. Go ahead.
So the access token at Flow 8 is the bearer token?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So, but it could be a Depop token or
We're not going to talk about
right. No, but like all I'm saying, it's an access token. It doesn't matter if it is a bearer or non-bearer, right? It's just an access token for now, right? But yeah, and most of the deployments these days is still a bearer token.
I'm confused about the access token and the ID token. What's like the main difference?
Yeah, good question. The ID token, the goal of ID token is to identify the user to that application, right? So to allow the user to go and log into the application. The access token is used by the client to access the API, okay? So that's the difference, okay? Any other questions? Go ahead.
the access token does get sent back to the browser, though, right?
Not in this flow, right? There are different flows. If we talk about a single page app, then you're right. Not in this flow. Okay? We will talk about those hopefully in the future. But obviously, each flow has its security properties. We can talk about those. But for now, I'm talking about the server-based applications. Okay? So the browser never gets access to the access token, only the code, which is a temporary thing, right? Good question. Thanks. Any other questions? Okay. Okay, so let's dig deeper, a little bit deeper, okay? So how does this magic happen? Like what's the story there? So again, the user tries to log in, send the login request. In this case, I'm showing the host as a local host or the application, because I'm gonna show you an application running on my laptop. So that's the reason. Now, the application says, hey, you want to authenticate? Go to Auth 0, for example, and authenticate. And that's the way they do it. So there is a specific header that they provide in the 302. It has a location. This location, for example, is my tenant at Auth 0, right? It has the response type, which is code, which is the authorization code flow that we're talking about here. There are other flows in the future. We can talk about those, but for now, focused on this one. This is the client ID. If you remember, when we registered the client, we had an ID, a specific unique ID for that application. So this is the client ID. They'll have to send it to the AS. This is the redirect URI. So this is telling the AS, hey, after you authenticate the user and everything is fine, redirect him back to this endpoint on my application. So I'll take it from there. Right? This is the scope. Like, what is it that you're trying to access? In this case, OpenID, a profile, whatever, right? State is just a local or a state associated with the client to allow it to resume the interaction when it gets back, when the browser comes back. Audience is the URL of the API that must be associated with the token. So when you create a token, the token will have a specific URL that it can call, right? So that's where the audience comes into play. And then nonce is a random value that used to protect against replay attack. Okay. So that's all of this is packaged into this reply and sent to the AS. Okay. Any question about any of those fields? Is that clear? Yeah, go ahead.
Does nonce token just make sure that no one changes the URLs and redirect URLs?
The nonce is just against replay attack. It's not against tampering. There are other measures to protect against tampering with the message. Okay.
How do you protect against that?
Yeah. So typically, all of this must be over TLS. And there are other ways, like instead of sending this in the URL, there are ways to send it in a JOT, and you can even encrypt that JOT, right? But for now, just talking about this simple, basic way of doing it. In the future, we'll dig deep into the security properties of different ones. But yeah, like the nonce is only against replay attack, not against tampering. Okay, good question. Other questions? Yep, go ahead.
Does scope have any other values except for profiling email?
Say it again. Sorry, scope.
The scope variable, can it have any other values?
Yeah, exactly. So there are scope. This is again a big topic that we can double click in the future. Scopes. There are standard defined scopes, but there are application specific scopes, and I'll show you examples of applications defined scopes in a second. But yeah, these are typically standard ones. But yeah, it depends on the application and what you're trying to do. Good question. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
So the scope, like whatever you mentioned in this scope, for example, in this case, it's profiling email.
Mm-hmm.
So is that exactly what the party is allowing the other resource to check for? For example, is that the only thing that is going to be provided access to, or can something else be provided access to as well?
Like as long as this is all you provided, this limits you to only all of those. Like you can get the ID token and get the profile information about the user. You can't do much beyond that otherwise. Like again, it depends on the application and it depends on the scopes you provide in that token. Okay, this is a good question. Okay, any other questions? Okay. Okay, so the client sends that in 302 back. So the browser just take that and send it to the AS. It doesn't change anything. It's just take the whole thing and send it to the AS. The AS then authenticates the user and then sends it back to the redirection endpoint on the client, right? So again, I'm showing local host because this is my local application here. It has the code, and which we will show, and which the client will use to get the tokens later on, and then the state again that we've talked about before. Okay, same state. A state is just allows the client to resume this interaction when the browser comes back. Okay. Now the browser makes that call with the code and the state to the application, and the application now sends that information to the AS. Okay, you see a grant type authorization code and the code itself, right? And in response, it will get the tokens, the access token, the ID token. Okay, at this point, the user is logged in and is able to interact with the application. And if they need to make an API call is made with the access token and information is provided. Again, this is an API call, so you'll get a raw data in JSON format, for example. And then the application takes that raw data and presents it in whatever form it sees fit. Go ahead.
What's the expired time of the code?
It's very, very short. Typically, there is a well-defined and configured time. But yeah, it's a good question. That code is a one-time thing, and it's very short, right? Okay. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Good question. Any other questions? Yep.
Why is it so short?
Because this is a temporary thing. Like we authenticated the user, we gave it that code, and we don't want if it leaks, we don't want anybody to be able to use it. I'm trying to go back here so people can hear me, maybe remotely, I guess. So you don't want that if that leaks, you don't want anybody to be able to use it. So that's the reason. It's short-lived. By the way, tokens also, and we can talk about this in future presentation. Tokens typically also short-lived. It depends on the application and what are you trying to achieve and how sensitive is your application. Okay, good question. Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
On the platform, there's like the PS and the MS inside box. Are they on the same module?
Good question. They don't have to be. Like in this case, they're absolutely completely different, even domains and different corporations, right? For example, Auth0 is or Okta or Microsoft or Azure. These are or AWS Cognito. These are completely separate application that you could create a tenant there, and your API as a corporation, you could have your APIs protected by those, right? They don't have to be on the same in the same server, but they could be, right? So if you have a proprietary AS in your corporation, it could be on the same thing, right? Sure. No, there's no dumb question.
What happens if the PS is unavailable?
What happened if the AS unable?
Unavailable. Like, unavailable for any reason.
Okay, good question. So typically, when you authenticate with the AS, you obtain a token that lives for some time. So you don't have to go back very frequently to the AS to get more. Unless you have a really kind of very secure and you're concerned about security, so that the life of the token will be very short, and you'll have to go to the AS. In that case, the availability of the AS is really critical. And obviously, these are highly available and scalable applications. So the availability and scalability of those applications are critical for the infrastructure of your network. But it's a good question. Absolutely, it's critical that the AS will be alive and there to serve you, right? Good question. Any other questions? Okay. Let's talk about the demo. Okay. So I'm going to use Auth0 as the AS, and maybe I'll show you Cognito too. I have a to-do API that is deployed on Render. Render is just a small cloud provider. You can create a free account. So I just create an account there, and I have an API. So I deployed it there. It's ready, waiting for me. Okay. And I have application that will be running on my laptop. Okay. So the client application is running on my laptop. I have my browser on my laptop. I have Auth0 or Cognito in the cloud, and I have that to-do API in the cloud. Okay. So let's see. Okay. So typically, because this is a free service, I need to wake up the API because it's not all the time there. But I'll do that here, and I'm gonna run my server here. Okay. Let's close this. Okay. Okay. So this is my application on the left here, right? On your right here, and this is the browser here. And now I'm going to show you actually my API. Here's my render, and here's the API, and it's alive right now. Okay, so I'm going to close this, and I'm going to go here, and I'm going to go to my application. Okay, I just typed localhost 8000. This is just my application running on my laptop here, and it's telling me, hey, welcome, you're a guest. You want to log in? This is just a simple. I have nothing here. I just want to show you what happened when I try to log in. Okay. So now remember, we have a client, we have the AS at the top, we have the API at the right there. So in this case, I'm communicating with the client, the browser communicating with the client, and it's trying to log in. So we'll get redirected to Auth0, authenticate there, and come back. Okay, remember the code. So that's what I'm going to show you. Okay, so let me actually do this. Okay, and okay, so I'm going to click login here, and now you can see that I'm right now at my tenant at Auth0, right? So I started on my application locally on my laptop, this application, which redirected me to Auth0, right? And you can see it here, right? So here's the local host request, the login request, and you can see the redirection here, the location. Remember that location thing? Then here's the call to the endpoint, the authorize the endpoint on Auth0, right? So you have the response type, the code, the client ID. This is my client ID. This is the redirect URL, the scope, and so on, right? All of that information that we showed you before, it's exactly in this request. Now I'm going to authenticate. Now this communication between the browser and Auth0 in this case is proprietary. We don't care. Like the protocols doesn't talk about this at all, right? It's out of scope. So the user authenticates, provide the user information, and the password. And again, the information, the credentials are sent to the AS only. The application never sees those, right? Continue. And I'm now back into my application and logged in, okay? I've done the login, okay? So, and when I logged in, I just want to show you the interaction between the AS and the client and the AS. Remember, like in the browser, you can see the interaction between the browser and the AS and the application, but you don't see the interaction between the client and the AS, right? So that's the reason I want to show you here. Here's the call to the token endpoint. This is the token endpoint on my tenant at Auth0, and this is a post request with the information, with the code, and so this is the post request itself, and this is the response, right? You get all the information. Here's the access token and the ID token, right? So, and I'm gonna show you the access token here. And copy this. I go to this application and just no. Hold on. Copy. Okay. So here is the token that we got, the access token. It has the obviously it has the header, the algorithm, the type, the key ID, specific ID that identifies this token. But the payload itself has the issuer, which is my tenant of Auth0, subject, the audience, which is the APIs that I can call with this token, right? So this is my API, right? Okay. Now if I go and try to access this, there are public APIs and there are private APIs, right? So this is a public API, but if I try to access a private API, it will tell me unauthorized, right? Because I don't have a token, right? And scope, for example, here are the standard ones, but I have to do add, to do delete. These are my application specific scopes, right? And that's the reason I can access the application, because I have the right scopes, okay? Okay, now I go back here and I click the to do, because now I want to use that token, access the API on render, right? Like I may get that render here. Not here. Okay, let me bring it here. Not Firefox. I want this here.
Question.
Yep.
User info part, is that the OpenID part?
Say that again. Sorry.
The user info that is part of the JWT payload. Is that the OpenID part?
Right. Yeah. This is the user OpenID endpoint. Yes, that's correct. Yes. So render here. I'm gonna go to my application. This is the API. I'm gonna show you here. So I'm gonna now call the API from this application. Okay, it's sent to do, and now and you'll see in a second it's updating. I got here's the get list API list, right? I got the list of to do from that API, and I presented here, right? And I can add another one, for example, OWASP talk, okay, and submit. Okay, I added another one, and you see here that I will in a second there you go. It post add API add. It added an item, and then it got the list to present it again, right? I can do all of this just because I have a token. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. Okay. Okay. Is that clear? Any questions about this? Okay. So I'm gonna show you same thing, but with Cognito, just to show you that it's the same concept.
Quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
For API call, where's the access token?
I closed it. Okay. I can show. You mean in here? I don't print it here.
Okay.
I don't show it here in
That's part
on
of
this.
the other.
Yeah, it's exactly in the header. This here is just to show you that you made a call, right? But it doesn't provide you all the details, right? This is just a log, a simple log, okay? But yeah, if I try to call this API directly, it will fail, right? I showed you before, right? So, okay. Now I just want to switch to a different application. In this case, it's a Cognito. Not this one. Hold on. Cognito. Okay. In this case, I'm not going to call an API. I just want to log in here and show you what happened, right? So localhost, in this case, I'm going to go and try to log in, okay? Okay, so now notice that I am right now, I've tried to log into the application. It redirected me to Amazon Cognito. You see I'm at Amazon Cognito here. I have the response type code, the client ID, the redirect URI, all the parameters that we've talked about are in this message, right? Now I can authenticate. I have my username and password. I'll authenticate, and I'm back on my application, and I'm logged in, okay? So the same concept, nothing different. It's just the way you configure AWS Cognito is different from the way you configure Auth0 or Okta or Microsoft Entra ID, whatever, right? But the concepts are the same concept. It's because there is a standard, and everybody is following that standard. Okay? That's the role of standard, right? Okay? So I think that's all I have for now. Any other questions? Yes?
So the authentication part between Cognito or Auth0, it's then up to the authorization server to talk to the application part to generate the tokens, because Auth0 and Cognito are the ones that are approving the username password.
Let's go back to
Yes, that's the diagram.
yeah, I'm gonna go back to this diagram. Okay. So I go to login page, right?
Right.
The application say, hey, I'm trying to log in my application. Hey, go to Auth0, authenticate there, and come back. Okay. I go there. Now I authenticate here, right? After I authenticate with the AS and everything is okay, the AS will create a code and send it back. And at the same time, they will create the tokens ready for the client. So I'll create that code, send it back to that browser. The browser send that code to the client, the application. And now the application say, okay, I'm ready. I want the tokens. I send that to the AS, and now I get the tokens.
So that's specifically between the client and the authorization server.
Correct. In this flow, yes, that's the way it works, right?
So for this flow, what situations is authorization code flow typically applied?
Typically, the authorization code flow is the best flow you could use, and it's typically used with a server-based application, but even a browser-based applications also use this. And there are many other details to secure the this whole exchange. There is PIC-C, there are I don't want to double click on those because it is just too much for this presentation. Yeah, I just want you to, I want to make sure you are at a high level, understand the basic flow, and after that we double click on those. Okay, but this is the basic stuff, right? Okay. Now after I get the tokens, now I am logged in because I have an ID token here, and I can use the access token to access the API. Okay. Okay. Question. Yeah.
Does the resource actually need to verify that access token against?
Very good question. Great question. So, remember we talked about different types of tokens. There is a reference token and there is a self-contained token. In a reference token, and we can show you in examples in the future maybe, the API must actually call back the AS. Like it will have to call it directly and get the information. In the self-contained, they don't have to call it directly, but they have a certificate that is used to validate the token itself, which was signed by. Correct, exactly. It's a JOT, has a signature, right? Good question. Any other questions? Yep.
Yeah, so for example, like me using Okta and logging to multiple applications, it's like single-sided, right?
Yeah.
That's based on either OAuth or incognito. That's what.
Yeah, same thing. In that case, when the browser communicates with the AS and authenticates, they will get also a token. A cookie, and that cookie will allow the user the browser to skip that authentication if they have a valid cookie still, right? Again, these are more advanced concepts that we can talk about them later, but at this stage, I want people to at least have a basic understanding of this specific flow, because this is the most important flow, and it's really critical that you understand this basic concept. After that, we can build on top of it. Yeah, go ahead.
I had a question on ID tokens.
Yeah.
What is the impact of risk if that gets leaked and not the access token?
It's mainly privacy, but there are some security implications too.
There is no way anyone can use that to gain the access token back, or
No. So the ID token just has information about the end user in more details, and so it's a privacy issue, but there are some security implications too. It depends. Like
can we use that to get the refresh token or no?
No. So ID token is just a way to allow you to log into the application, right? Sometimes you can use it to prove, hey, I have something, and helps you with the interaction, right? But only by itself, it's not good enough, right? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I know that sometimes when the bearer token is leaked and then the API side doesn't double check, like the recent release, it will lead to some exploit of information. What can someone do to prevent?
Very good question. So the question was that sometimes those tokens are leaked, and because it's a bearer token, anyone can use it. So what can you do? So first, you need to make sure that the communication between those entities are secured through TLS. That's for sure. Another idea is to make sure the life of that token is short-lived. So yeah, even if it leaked, it will live for an hour or two, and after that will expire, so it will be useless. And the third one is using a sender-constrained token, which we didn't talk about, or DPoP, if you've heard of DPoP. These are sender-constrained, so meaning that if you want to use that token, you have to prove that you actually own that token, okay? These are more advanced concepts, and this is actually an RFC that was published just last year. And it will protect against those type of leaks and problems. Okay. Any other questions?
To request a refresh token, does the user need to re-authenticate?
No. As long as they have a valid access token, they can provide a refresh token. They get, like when the user logs in, I didn't talk about a refresh token, but tokens here typically have access token and ID token, but you can also request a refresh token. That refresh token lives on the client, and it's only for the communication between the client and the AS. So if the client has an access token and that expired, all the client has to do is use the refresh token to communicate with the AS. They don't have to go back to the user because they have a refresh token. They can mint another access token. Okay?
And it's possible for them to keep refreshing.
Correct. Right. Good question. I didn't talk about refresh token. We wanted to keep it for future, but yeah, that's the basic idea, and we can show this example in the future. Right. Good question. Any other questions?
Nobody else has got a question. I've got one last question.
Sure.
I'm glad somebody mentioned Okta, and there's probably a sitting room half of other attackers. What's your favorite OAuth server target?
I'm not going to talk about this. Sorry.
I had to ask. All right. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank
you.
I think we're going to have you back.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I'd happy to be here to talk about more detailed stuff. Okay.
We have stickers. Please don't make me take them home again.